According to the IMF, the combined GDP of North American countries in 2023 was about $30 trillion. In comparison, the combined GDP of the 12 South American countries was only about $4 trillion. This means the North American economy is over 7 times larger than that of the South American economy. South America may have all of the so-called flavor, but North America has all of the money. But why is this so? Let's find out. Today, South America has countries that share similar cultures, have a young population, good geological conditions, and a lot of natural resources. However, it finds itself considerably poorer than North America, whose nations have less in common. But to understand the reason why North America is so much richer than South America, we need to go all the way back to the 17th century. Following the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, the entire American continent was basically comprised of colonies owned by the British, French, Spanish, and even the Portuguese. The British and the French carved up most of the north, while the Spanish, and to a lesser extent the Portuguese, carved out most of the south. In some of those colonies, a majority of the population was slaves who had been shipped in mostly from West Africa and a few European countries. They were so-called slave colonies and often featured thousands of slaves working on various plantations. At that point in history, these European colonies, both at the north and the south of the American continent, were looked upon as lands of promise, which led to massive immigration from across Europe starting from the 16th century. For much of the 16th and 17th century, the wealth gap between North and South America would be almost unnoticeable, although North America was a bit richer due to the fact that British set up more colonies than the Spanish, mostly due to the decline of the Spanish Empire.
The Spanish Empire collapsed relatively early compared to the English Empire or the British Empire, which continued on into North America, specifically the United States and Canada.
It also helped that the British colonies, in what would become the United States, chose to unify and create a solid government, while those of the Spanish in the South did not, because they couldn't. However, the tide would not fully turn for North America until the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain around the year 1760, before spreading to continental Europe and the United States over the next 7 or 8 decades. Suddenly, societies went from using hand production methods to using machines. The use of steam and hydropower, as well as the development of rail travel and new manufacturing processes, was also on the rise. Unsurprisingly, general economic output grew at unprecedented rates, and as output grew, so did the population of industrializing nations. Fun fact: the first rail line in South America was opened in Cuba in 1837, only 12 years after the inauguration of the first British railway, and ran from Havana to Bejucal. Meanwhile, the first rail line in North America was completed a decade earlier, in 1827, in Ohio, with the first mechanical passenger train coming 3 years later in 1830. The Industrial Revolution ushered in a new age of prosperity for nations who had gotten involved. Sadly, in the Americas, it mostly occurred in the North American countries, which meant that their southern counterparts were left playing catch-up while they grew their own economies to record heights, particularly in the United States. Just by being colonized by the British, the US had a significant head start over the rest of the continent, and even the other countries in North America. It began to build rails, factories, and other vital industries that set the tone for becoming the powerhouse that it is today. And its neighbors in the north certainly benefited just off sharing a border with it. While you could say benefiting off the Industrial Revolution set the tone for what's to come to the Americas, there were other nations at the time which didn't benefit from the Industrial Revolution but have gone on to become powerhouses today. China is arguably the best example of this. During the 18th century, China was still under the Qing dynasty, and although it was a prosperous nation in its own right, it faced a lot of conflict, particularly with the West, who tried to entice them into taking part in the Industrial Revolution, opening up new trade routes. China, under the Qing dynasty, shut out the Westerners but could only hold out for so long, until the early to mid-19th century, when they lost the two Opium Wars against the British and gave up a lot of their traditions. Today, China is the second largest economy in the world by GDP, following what was probably the greatest ever economic miracle in history. It's obvious that not partaking in the Industrial Revolution could not have been the only reason South American nations are poorer than their northern counterparts. So before we dive into the reason why, let's compare some statistics of both nations to understand the broader picture. Starting off with size, with a landmass area of about 24.7 million square kilometers, North America is significantly larger than South America, which comes in at around 17.84 million square kilometers. There are also more countries and people in North America than South America. North America has 23 sovereign nations with a combined population of almost 600 million, which is about 8% of the world's population, while South America has just 12 countries with a combined population of almost 450 million people, or about 6% of the global population. However, North America's advantage is supplemented by the fact that Central American and Caribbean nations are regarded as belonging to North America rather than being their own entity. When you combine those economic figures with the population of both subcontinents, you get an average GDP per capita for North American nations of just over $59,000 or $62,500 when adjusted for purchasing power parity, and for South American nations of just over $9,200 or $18,780 when adjusted for purchasing power parity. These figures are greatly skewed in favor of countries like Mexico and the Caribbean nations, who generally produce significantly less stuff than their northern big brothers, the United States and Canada. Another statistic that shows North America's significant economical capacity over South America is the number of billionaires on both sides. While South America has just over 915,000 billionaires, North America has a whopping 26.8 millionaires, which is by far the most of any continent, and almost as any as the next two continents, Europe and Asia Pacific combined. The largest economy in South America is Brazil, with a GDP of over $2.3 trillion, which actually makes it the second most productive nation in both the South and North America as of the time of making this video. By comparison, the largest economy in North America is the United States, with its massive GDP of almost $29 trillion, which makes it number one, not just on the entire continent, but in the entire world. Fun fact, did you know that with all things considered, the United States technically isn't the largest economy on Earth? When adjusted for purchasing power parity, its GDP of slightly less than $29 trillion is actually the second largest on the planet. The first? You probably guessed it. It's China, with a GDP of $35.3 trillion when adjusted for purchasing power parity. That's an over 20% increase on the GDP of the US. The aforementioned stats give you an idea of North America's significant advantage over South America, but it doesn't tell you the full story. That's because the reasons North America is the richer subcontinent goes beyond that. Let's explore what these reasons are. There is not one single reason why North America is significantly richer than South America, rather than a number of factors combined to give North America an advantage in certain situations, and South America a disadvantage in others. We have to kick it off with the geography of both regions. North America is mostly located on the northern hemisphere, which means it's located in proximity to most of the world's richest nations from every continent, bar Australia and Antarctica. This has provided it with significant economic and military advantages just from logistics alone, but stretching far beyond that. South America, on the other hand, may be pretty close to North America, but that's pretty much the closest it is to what you would usually call a thriving economic subregion. Nevertheless, South America is still a decent distance away from continents like Europe, which its nations commonly trade with today. Next on the list is political and economic stability. North American countries like the United States and Canada have enjoyed centuries of relative political stability. On the contrary, many South American nations still experience a volatile political atmosphere, with corruption quite common. It's always as if there's something crazy going on in at least one South American country at every point in time. This has made setting up trade routes and agreements across the continent much more difficult, as no one is ever sure if the leaders of other nations are there for the long term or even if they have actual plans to develop their countries. Economic crises are also more common in South America, and poverty is much more widespread. A case in point is Venezuela, whose economy experienced the worst inflation in South American history at the end of 2016, which led to its currency, the bolivar, losing almost 100% of its value within a couple of years. Fun fact, the IMF estimated that the inflation rates for Venezuela in 2017 and 2018 topped 1,600% and 2,880% respectively, with the prices of some goods multiplying by up to 100 times. Another example of South America's penchant for suffering economic instability is Argentina. A country which has the second largest economy on a subcontinent is expected to at least be stable enough for investors, but even this couldn't be guaranteed. Argentina is currently in an inflation crisis, with its annual inflation reported to be around 271%, which is more than what the United States has suffered in the past 2 decades combined. Such volatility only discourages willing investors, who often decide to make a safer bet and move a bit towards North Central American countries like Mexico. North America is also far more industrialized and technologically productive than South America. In fact, Mexico alone produces more stuff for the global market than a majority of South American nations, and it's been able to achieve this just by sharing a border with the global leader in industrialization, manufacturing, and technological innovation. In case you thought about it, no, it's not China, at least not yet anyway. South American countries, on the other hand, have had a more resource extraction-based economy, and most of its technological advancements are usually into machines that could help them dig up stuff from the ground. While the drivers of the current global economy are shifting towards a digital age, where things like microchips and components to make them are the new oil, South American nations have remained relatively dependent on agriculture and resource extraction, the latter which is barely sustainable. Natural resources have also played a role in North America's financial dominance over South America. Believe it or not, North America has more valuable natural resources than South America. This advantage is further supplemented by North America's technological advantage, particularly in the form of extraction technology. North American nations have been able to leverage this technical advancement to boost the extraction and yield of their abundant natural resources in order to fuel economic development. South American countries also have significant resources, but the technology and know-how to safely and properly extract them is often lacking, meaning that those resources are either underdeveloped or underutilized. Fun fact! Did you know that with more than 303 billion barrels, Venezuela actually has the world's largest oil reserves? There's even more than the entire North American subcontinent combined. One reason Venezuela hasn't become rich from its oil is that it has relatively poor restrictive infrastructure, which is a theme for most South American nations. That's why, despite its massive reserves, it only produces less than 750,000 barrels of oil per day, which isn't even top 15 in the world. Another factor that gives North America the edge over its neighbors to the south is the high level of investment and trade that occurs within its nation. The North American economy is well diversified into a portfolio of production, technology, trade, finance, and services, which gives foreign investors a lot of options. This is the reason why the U.S. economy is the most heavily invested in by foreign nations in the world, with over $6 trillion of other countries' monies currently propping it up, according to a report published by the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. By stark contrast, the entire South America only received about $160 billion in 2022, according to UNCTAD, in what has been regarded as a great year for foreign investment into the subcontinent. And that's less than a third of a tenth of what the U.S. alone received. Trade is a very strong suit of North American countries, especially the United States, and this is evident in the sheer amount of trade blocs which North American nations are a part of. One of those blocks is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, which is made up of a group of 21 Pacific Rim countries which spread across 4 continents, including the entire North America, but crucially excluding every South American country aside Chile and Peru, which are 2 of the smallest countries in the region. Another trade bloc is CAFTA, or the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which promotes free trade between the U.S. and Central American countries, including Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. There's also NAFTA, which is basically the same thing as CAFTA, but with Canada and Mexico instead, with some sectors suggesting that this agreement could eventually develop into a North American Union similar to the EU. Finally, one more vital factor that people don't seem to bring up often is the language barrier. This arguably plays a big role in the economic divide as the other factors on this list. South American nations mostly speak either Spanish or Portuguese, which when combined have around 900 million speakers across the globe. By comparison, Mandarin is spoken commonly only in China, but it has over 1.1 billion speakers globally, which makes up almost 14% of the global population. English, which is the most spoken language, has over 1.5 billion speakers and billions more who understand it to a simple communication level. Additionally, most of the highest skilled workers on the planet speak English to a certain extent, which means that they will most likely seek out English-speaking nations when offering their services. North American nations generally speak English, and although there's a significant presence of French and Spanish speakers, a majority of them also speak English. This means that there's a much larger pool of skilled workers for these nations to select from across the globe in comparison to the South American nations who have the language barrier to deal with. Ultimately, while these factors on their own play an insignificant role in determining which subcontinent becomes richer, when combined, they form an almost insurmountable hurdle for South America as it looks to overtake its neighbors in the north. For South America to compete financially with North America, its nations would need to come together and plan strategically for the future of their populations. They would need to invest in trade and infrastructure in order to facilitate considerable technological and economic advancements. Luckily for South American nations, they have a blueprint they could take some notes off of in the form of the Southeast Asian region, which is in the process of transforming from a mostly agrarian region to one of the biggest service-providing regions on the planet. Countries like Singapore and Malaysia have experienced massive growth in the past few decades and changed their reputations for the better. So it's definitely possible for South American countries to come together and attempt to recreate something similar. Whether this would ever happen, though, that's anyone's guess. So, South American nations may be better at football or soccer, but until the aforementioned factors are dealt with, it's hard to see a future where they become richer than North America. But what do you think?